So welcome to our first proper, but second in reality, Hull Noir 3-Book Friday. I'm Nick Triplow, one of the co-founders of Hull Noir and a writer, and with my colleague Nick Quantrill, also a writer and co-founder of Hull Noir, we'll be asking our guests this evening to talk about 3 books, to choose 3 books that have most influenced them as writers and readers, and we'll be discussing what makes them must-reads. The format's pretty straightforward, so there's kind of 3 rounds, and the first one is a book that's either been given to you or recommended to you. The second round is a book that you'd give to somebody else or have given to somebody else, or that you'd recommend. And the third is a book that's influenced our guests as writers. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, please do use the hashtag Hull Noir 3BF. And also, if you want to like or subscribe the video, that helps us to know who's listening. And if you want to know anything about it, just get in touch.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. So I'm Nick Quantrill, another third of Hull Noir. I'll quickly introduce our 2 guests for you so we know who's speaking. First of all, I've got Cathi Unsworth, who's just underneath me on the panels on Zoom. Cathi is a novelist, a writer and an editor who lives and works in London. She began her career on the legendary music weekly Sounds at the age of 19. Her first novel, The Not Knowing, was published in 2005, followed in 2007 by the punk noir novel, The Singer, which features a band in Hull, doesn't it, Cathi, as well, which is a nice touch.
It does.
Yeah. Her 2012 book, Weirdo, A Tale of Teenage Trauma and Female Transgression, set on the Norfolk coast, was longlisted for the 2014 Folkestone Oh Peculiar Crime Novel of the Year. And that was followed by 2 novels set in World War II, Without the Moon and That Old Black Magic. In between those, the 3rd novel, Bad Penny Blues, inspired by the unsolved Jack the Stripper murders of 1959 to 1965, was initially published in 2010 to critical acclaim. But a new edition of that book has recently been published by Stranger Tractor Press and is available now. So that's great. Our second guest underneath me as well on the Zoom panels is Rod Reynolds. Rod is the author of 4 novels, including the Charlie Yates trilogy set in 1940s America. His 2015 debut, The Dark Inside, was longlisted for the CWA New Blood Dagger and was followed by Black Night Falling and Cold Desert Sky. A lifelong Londoner, in 2020, a Render book published his first novel set in his hometown, Blood Red City, and Rod has previously worked in advertising as a media buyer and holds an MA in novel writing from the City University, London. His latest book, Black Reed Bay, which is published later this month, is a US set contemporary thriller. So a little bit of a change again, Rod. Back to America for you.
Yep.
Excellent. Right, shall we get into it then, Nick? So the first category is a favourite book that was given to you. Do you want to kick us off, Cathi? Ladies first, which book have you chosen?
Oh, thank you. This is a really special one for me. Old and decrepit though it is now. This was given to me by my dad when I was about 10. But it was actually, I don't know if you can see this, he won it for being his English prize in 1955. So he was
awesome.
a student. And in this book is where I first encountered The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is a story that it still captivates me, actually. And I think Sherlock Holmes was my first love in crime fiction. And it was because when I was a little girl, they were showing on TV quite regularly the Sherlock Holmes series that with Basil Rathbone that had been made during the war. They're hilarious when you watch them now. They're like only The Hound of the Baskervilles, I think, is an original Conan Doyle story. Most of them are propaganda films for World War II, and they feature such geographical delights as the docks of Soho and things like that. But I loved Basil Rathbone. I thought he looked super suave and mysterious and very goth, actually. And I think that it's a really interesting thing for me about Sherlock Holmes. He's the person I probably would want to be in all of crime fiction if I could be anyone. But he's also a warning from history, isn't he? That he drove Conan Doyle mad because he wasn't allowed to let go of him, and he drove successive people who wanted to portray him mad, including my favourite, the lovely Jeremy Brett, who made that amazing series in the 80s, which I've just been indulging in again after I got a box set of it for Christmas. And I have to say, they don't make programs to that high design quality anymore. So, and I think the other thing about The Hound of the Baskervilles that continues to resonate for me is that he got the story, even though it's set in Dartmoor and the location's brilliant. The story comes from Norfolk, from Cromer, which he was a fashionable resort in Victorian times. They used to call it Poppyland. And there's some wild cliffs by Cromer, and the devil dog, old Shuck, he was like the Norfolk legend, is said to roam those cliffs at night. And I think he heard that story while he was there on holiday and transposed that Norfolk devil dog into Dartmoor. So that's a sort of personal link with me in that story as well.
Yeah. What about you?
I was going to say the guy who I always thought should have played Sherlock Holmes if after Jeremy Brett should have been Ian Richardson.
Yeah, that would have been good.
And I remember they did a one-off about the Edinburgh doctor. Was it Dr. Bell, who was Conan Doyle's mentor at university?
The guy
he was the guy who had those deduction skills that kind of taught Conan Doyle.
Yeah, the real one.
The real one.
Have you read any Conan Doyle, Rod? Because it feels to me like he's kind of like a staple of crime writers' backgrounds, isn't he? You know, it feels like, certainly for me, I went from the famous five to Conan Doyle and then leapt into sort of more recognisable adult books. In terms of adult books, that sounds a bit wrong, adult books in the sense of crime writing. we'll jump past the teenage years. But yeah, Conan Doyle was kind of like that stepping stone, I think, to more kind of adult themes in crime writing for me as a reader. Did you get anything like that, Rod? Was that yours?
It's interesting you said that, actually, because I haven't read the biggest amount of Conan Doyle. I'm quite a bad crime author in that sense, but I did do exactly what you've just described, which is I got given as a kid a set of, not Dorling Kindersley, but that kind of equivalent, sort of illustrated, the classic Sherlock Holmes stories. And I remember, I can picture to this day the images from The Hound of the Baskervilles because it scared the life out of me. Yeah. And, exactly as you described, I was still reading Famous Five, Secret Seven, that kind of thing. So to pick this up and read it, I was utterly terrified. And it's, as I say, it's an image I can see in my mind right now to this day. That's how much the story kind of resonated with me. So yeah, absolutely.
What about you, Nick? Was you a reader of Conan Doyle?
I was, yeah. I mean, to be honest, he was definitely my entry point into crime fiction. Although I was sort of reading thrillers off my dad's bookshelves, probably when I was like 14 or 15, but I can remember reading the short stories. It's another one that I've often said about at that period of time when musicians and bands were talking about the books they read. So, Weller was pictured with a copy of 1984, and it's obviously Absolute Beginners. But in one interview, I remember him saying that his favourite book was the Sherlock Holmes Adventures, the short stories. And so, he kind of gave you, it was all right. It was quite a cool thing to be reading.
Yeah, that was a book I had. I remember having a big hardback of short stories I got maybe when I was about 13 or 14 as a Christmas gift, and loving it, absolutely loved them. Yeah, Rod, so you've chosen a more contemporary writer, haven't you, for a book that was given to you as an influence, Neon Rain by James Lee Bear. Tell us about that book.
So, like a lot of the best things in my life, the first time I read this, I didn't really like it at all. It was given to me. So, we got, long story short, a family friend who lived in the States, was American, and as a kid, I got the opportunity to go and stay with him and his family 2 or 3 times and spend some extended periods out there, which was really kind of shaping for me as a kid. And one of the things he did, he gave me this book and a different copy of it. And I'd never read any James Lee Burke. I was still reading, I was probably into thrillers by that point, but a bit like Nick was saying, it was kind of what I could get my hands on in the school library, or, I wasn't buying my own stuff. So I read this and I didn't really get it. It was too good for me at the time, in the sense that I'm just reading it, looking for the twist, looking for, the kind of the big high concept stuff. I think I was probably just about reading some John Grisham maybe at the time. So I'm looking for like The Firm or The Pelican Brief. And I just didn't get it. And I read it, put it aside, and didn't think anything of it. And it was only years later when I came back to it, and you look at it again and you go, oh my God, the poetry, the lyricism, the characterization, the dialogue. And it just blew me away. And I've read it probably once every couple of years ever since, to be honest. And it's the first in the Robber Show books, which is the best of James Lee Burke's work for my money. And it's obviously the one that introduces both Robber Show, but also more importantly, Cleek Purcell, who is, if Cathi said she wanted to be Jeremy Brett's version of Sherlock Holmes, I think I would like to be Cleek Purcell, even though he's described, I just noticed on page 3, as having a face like boiled pigskin. But he's just a great character. So if you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to go and find any Cleek Purcell book you can get your hands on.
Yeah, I've not actually read any James Lee Burke, which feels like a slightly shocking admission to make for a crime writer. So is this the place to start? Definitely at the beginning of the series. Yeah,
I mean, he's not as big over here, obviously, and as revered as he is in the States. And I can kind of get that. He's very, very of his time and place. I have a sort of leaning towards American fiction anyway, but if you don't know anything about New Iberia Parish in Louisiana, I can kind of get why, to most people it might not appeal. But yeah, that's a really good place to start. It's a really tightly written novel, well plotted. Some of his later ones he lets the plotting go a little bit as he got more established, but this one is well plotted, tight. It's not a big read. It's just one of the great crime novels of the genre.
What about you? Have you read any James Lee Burke, Cathi? Is he a writer on your radar?
I was quite lucky in my early 20s, and in the early 90s I worked for Melody Maker, and I got to go to America loads of times because of that. And there was this fantastic band that I loved over there called the Bad Livers, who were a bluegrass band, but they did like Motorhead cover versions, and I did a Neubauer cover version. And their banjo version of Lust for Life is the best thing you've ever heard. The best cover version of all time. And they were really into their literature as well. And they came from Texas, and they told me about him, about Cormac McCarthy, who they loved and who they actually even knew. One of them, the fiddle player, he was a tree surgeon, and he had worked on Cormac McCarthy's ranch, and he actually knew where he was, which was amazing to me. And I think, and they had this brilliant record they made called Horses in the Mines, and it was partially inspired by one of James Lee Burke's books called To the Bright and Shining Sun, which I don't know if you've read that one, but anyway, there's a whole load of writers from that time and that place. I'd also say Daniel Woodrule is another really brilliant one. He just have that beautiful, like you said, Rod, that poetic voice and that way of talking, not just about the land, but the people who live on that land and how closely connected with it they are. Absolutely. Those poor white trash that don't get to have their voices heard. They're poet laureates, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the black equivalent as well, obviously Walter Maseley was doing really brilliant stuff there, and James Sallis was writing his brilliant books, or with the Lou Griffin books. That whole time in that place is brilliant.
Yeah, that's my kind of sweet spot. If I could read everything from that kind of time and area, that would be me.
Yeah.
I think you're a fan, aren't you, Nick? I'm pretty sure you've tried to push this book on me before, haven't you? And I've got it's all coming back to me now, actually. I
think I emptied my shelves of Daniel Woodrule and piled them up in front of you. And
we've been on this road before, and it's all coming back. So what is it about James Lee Burke for you then as a writer? Is it that lyricism in his prose that attracted you initially as a reader?
It's that, and it's the fact that when you write about that part of the world, you're instantly writing about outsiders. You can't help it, and I think there is a kind of natural noir fit to that it's the very sort of antithesis of being like contrived, and it's just natural. And I suppose it's the music of the prose as much as anything else. Once you kind of commit that, and I think the worst thing as a writer, it's not the sort of stuff I like to read if I'm writing, because that music gets in your head and you can't really emulate it. I mean, you can try, but it ends up feeling like pastiche, and that's just not good. But absolutely, both of those really, I'd agree with both of those as books that you'd give to somebody.
Right, round 2, I think, Nick. Do you want to?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is books you give to somebody, isn't it? So I'm going to ask Cathi first. Yours is Oranges and Lemons by Christopher Fowler.
Yes, well, it could be any of Christopher Fowler's absolutely fantastic Brian and May books, but this is just the most recent one. And it came out in the middle, and look how beautiful that cover is.
Yeah,
just get a big
nice.
wedge of that. I mean, it's like one of those go away on the train posters, isn't it, from the 1970s. And if you don't know about Brian and May, the whole brilliant idea about them was that they are part of the Peculiar Crimes Unit, which was founded by Winston Churchill in 1939 to investigate strange crimes that they didn't want to startle the public with. And they're now in their 80s and they're still doing this job from their ramshackle base in King's Cross, which is not too far from where the actual author of the books lives. But what I super love and would recommend, it's really hard to pick one book to recommend, but I don't think I have got as much joy out of any other series as Brian and May. And it's such an original idea. In these books, he explores a different thing that you didn't know about London, whether it's what happens on the underground, whether it's the history of the pubs. And in Oranges and Lemons, it's based on the nursery rhyme Oranges and Lemons. And he goes through all these layers of the city and meets all these different people from every possible background, and weaves it all together in a sort of stunning mystery. And I suppose it links to The Hound of the Baskervilles in that everything that they start off investigating, you think, oh my God, there's a supernatural element to it. There's a pub that vanishes, or there's somebody being murdered in the exact locations of the churches of Oranges and Lemons in this, and somebody's sort of attacked by a lorry load of oranges and lemons at the beginning. But in the end, it's always a logical explanation. And these two old men, that one of them is really stuck in the past after Brian, and he's got a circle of witches that he goes to ask advice from. And the other one is teched up John May. He is the techie, and he's in with the hackers, and they're like, say they represent the two different, old is good, but new is also good, and they have to find a way of working in harmony and overcoming. Yeah.
So I've not read any of this series. So what I was going to say to you is this a good place to come in?
Yeah, any of them is a good.
Right.
If you start with any of them, you quickly get obsessed with them. And he's such a clever and funny writer. The pages will turn really quickly. Yeah. And you'll be thinking all the time, how the hell are they going to get out of it? And he always, that's the thing, he studied those locked doors mystery books, but which I don't find all that interesting, but he turns them with the psychogeography of London and everything, all the secret knowledge that he put, and just how witty, he is probably the wittiest person since Oscar Wilde. He puts that all in to these, and they're just an absolute joy, and everyone I do give them to just loves them. They are addictive.
They reminded me of the two characters, Charters and Caldecott, who turned up in The Lady Vanishes. Yes,
they are sort of like that, and I think they're sort of, one of them could be an alter ego of Christopher's, and one of them is an alter ego of one of his old friends, the fuddy-duddy sort of with the sweets stuck in his pocket.
Yeah,
not Christopher, the suave John May is him. It's all his lifetime's love of London and all its stories and all its secrets that he, and all his film knowledge as well. He's also the person that coined the phrase "in space no one can hear you scream." So that's what a genius Chris is. So.
Right.
I think it's incredibly hard to write humour in crime as well. I think, to be able to kind of infuse crime writing with humour is an incredibly tough thing to do.
Yeah.
Have you read them, Nick?
I've read one. I'm terrible at titles. I can't remember which one, but I know my wife's a huge fan of the series. So we have plenty of them lying around. So I should really dig in deeper, shouldn't I, and read more of them.
If she's got the Victoria Vanishes, I would start with that. That's the pub one. So that will be your way in, Nick.
Right. Okay. Noted.
Rod, have you read them?
I haven't, no. It's funny, they've been on I saw Christopher speak at an event, years ago, and they were on my radar since then, but I knew the conceit was the peculiar crimes unit, but I didn't realise they were so heavily into, as you say, London and its history and kind of quirks. And that, I mean, as I say, as someone who's lived in London all my life, that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do love that hook of, it reminds me of obviously like Mick Herron's books, the Slough House guys, you know, that kind of bunch of oddballs who are still investigating things on sort of on the sly. So that, on both those levels, it really appeals to me. So I think I'm going to have to check those out.
I think it's what I like about those sorts of things is that they unpeel some of those layers of London that are all there. And I think I sort of come away from them thinking, you know, whatever happens, whatever governments do, whatever foreign powers do, actually London is indestructible and it will always find its way back to where it needs to be.
Yeah,
Rod, your book that you'd pass on recommend is The Good German by Joseph Cannon. I've got my copy here as well.
There we go.
So do you want to tell us a little about, you know, why you'd recommend that?
So I chose this one for Pass It On. It's because it's one of my favourite books anyway, but I think Joseph Cannon is one of the most criminally overlooked authors on this side of the pond. I think one of the problems is this is his only book that I think crossed into the mainstream because it got made into a film, but the film was awful, like truly terrible, and doesn't fairly represent the book at all, which is kind of understandable because it is a really complex plot. It takes in a lot. It's set in Berlin immediately after the ceasefire at the end of World War II. So instantly the setting is just so gripping because you've got this city that is literally still being torn apart. You've got the Russians there, the British, the Americans. It's been divided up into sectors, but it's well before there's any kind of you know, infrastructure around that. So it's literally, there's still people digging bodies out of the burning rubble. It's that close to the end of the war. And into that, you throw this group of kind of newsmen who are there to cover the post-war conferences with Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt. But obviously what they're really looking for is the real story, because the conference is the one stage managed, tightly kind of scripted element of what's going on, and everything else is just utter chaos. It's the chaos of war. You've got bootleggers who are loving it, who are making out and making money there. You've got obviously people who are desperate to go home. You've got people who are utterly destroyed and their lives have been ripped to shreds. And it's so incredibly brought to life on the page and so beautifully rendered. I mean, the prose is wonderful anyway. It's economical, but it's also piercing in its own way. And every now and then he'll just drop a line. There's one line that keeps coming up throughout the book, and it's Berlin, always something worse. And basically, it's as you go through, there's you know, tales of something that's happened, and the lead character finds out something that's happened, some awful atrocity or some tragedy that's befallen one of the residents, and you think that's the worst, and then you find out, well, actually, then something even worse happened. Or you find out something awful that someone did, and then you find out, well, actually, they were compromised because the Nazis had a family or something. And it's, again, Berlin, always something worse. And it's just, it's incredibly moving, but it's also, it's not, you know, I'm not great on books that are just kind of disaster porn tragedies, if you like. And it's certainly not that. It's definitely a mystery, because the heart of the plot revolves around this dead body that turns up as the conference is kind of kicking off. So obviously that's a huge embarrassment for the Russians, for the Germans, for the Americans. And then there's this race to find out what's gone on, but it brings in so much more of that time and place. And it's one of those books that truly, you know, I know it's cliche, but the setting is a character in so many ways. Because, and I think that's specifically true of this book, because it's so rare that you will find a setting that is like that. You know, this isn't just a description of a place that's unfamiliar or different or unique. This is an absolutely incomprehensible moment in time of what was happening in that city, and I just think he captures it perfectly. And he's written a number of other books set around that time and in sort of roughly in that period that are all really good reads, but this is, you know, by far and away his kind of masterpiece. And so I would press this on pretty much anyone who will take it.
Yeah, and I'd probably go along with that. I mean,
I'm sold.
He's often compared to John le Carré. He's often compared to Graham Greene, and you'd probably add Robert Harris to that list as well of writers of kind of complex post-war thrillers. I think, I don't know, from my perspective, I was trying to remember the film, and it really isn't that memorable. And I think what I do remember about it was it completely lacks the heart and soul that's in the novel, and that was as you're saying, you get the feels from it. It really kind of resonates in quite a powerful way. It's a great read, and again, I'd definitely go along with recommending that. Have you read it, Cathi?
No, I haven't. I've read all Philip Carr's books, or nearly all of them, about Berlin, which I love, and think they are, an invaluable sort of guide to how Germany changes from before the war up to the 50s. But I've not read this one, and I would really.
I think he manages to do what your Second World War novels do, which is to get under the skin of the city at that point of flux, at that point of, it could go either way. It could go any way. In fact, in this case, which is obviously what Without the Moon and that Magic have done. But he's in a similar kind of the city speaks kind of way.
Yeah, and what a city got, as you were just saying, Rod, in Berlin. What a city. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to be buying that novel tomorrow, I suspect, when I visit a book shop. So that's me sold a copy.
I'll send my invoice to.
Yeah, please do. So our third question is a book that's influenced your own writing. So I guess this is kind of the big one, isn't it, really? Yeah. So for you, Cathi, you've chosen Derek Raymond, haven't you? Laura Suarez. Tell us about Derek's influence on you as a writer.
Well, if I hadn't met him, I don't think I would be doing this. I think that was the starting point. Well, it was the next point on from Sherlock Holmes, actually.
Right.
Because I met Robin because I was interviewing him when he made a record with my friends in Gallon Drunk of Dora Suarez. And so I got this book to read before I met him. And it totally changed my life, I would say, because I hadn't realised until I read Dora Suarez that a crime fiction book could be about not the amazing detective, or it was at the time when Hannibal Lecter was really big, and all books were about serial killers and charming serial killers, as if there was such a thing. And this was a book about the victim, and she was killed because she was a woman, basically. And when I met Robin, and I looked back at the interview that I did with him, and it's really quite moving actually to look back on. But he did say what happened was he saw a crime scene. One of his friends brought around a book of crime scene photos, and there was this beautiful girl with black hair and a scimitar coming out of her chest. And he was so haunted by this picture, he had to go home and start writing a story about this girl because he was so affected by her. And then he said it took him 18 months to write the story, and it nearly drove him mad. But when I met him, he sounds like it would be an austere and forbidding man, but in fact he was like a party on two legs. He was amazing. And he's one of these people that everyone gravitated to. He was the funniest. He was 65 and I was 25 or something like that. But he didn't seem like there was an age difference. And because he'd had this brilliant rackety past as a criminal himself and putting his Eton tie to good use, fronting up law firms for associates of the Cray twins. And he'd done all that in the early 60s. He was a proper Maury, and you would have loved his suits that he had then, Nick, his little thin ties and his little sharp suits. And it was so cool. And then he'd gone off and done all these mad things, like being the head of his local anarchist collective in Italy, and had his own vineyard, and he fucking swore like that. It was fucking brilliant, his voice. And he was just, everybody wanted to be his best friend. And I just thought, he's the Johnny Rotten of crime fiction. I want to be like you. So he was my very role model, basically. And that book was the book that showed me what crime fiction could be. So that's where I started my apprenticeship.
Excellent. And for you, Rod, you've chosen another giant, really, of kind of the noir sort of tradition, James Ellroy, the big nowhere. Because obviously, you're Londoner born and bred, but you've written most of your work set in America. Is it, I guess, because of Ellroy?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, the parallels of what Cathi was saying are quite striking, actually, in that I'd always been a reader and loved books, but never thought about being a writer, never once considered it. And then I read, a friend of mine was reading The Cold 6000, one of Ellroy's books, when I was about 22, picked it up, started reading it, just idly, just flicking through it. I was like, I no idea what's going on here. I don't know what this is. Why doesn't this man use full sentences? What is going on here? And then you read it, and I was just blown away. And then I moved on to his other books, And it was the first time that I'd ever thought to myself, Christ, I wish I could do something like that. I think I can do that. Just I wish I could create something that powerful and that moves me in that way. That was really the starting point. I mean, I went off and did what everyone does. I tried to write a sort of knockoff Elroy book, and I think I got about a page in before I realised, no, that's not going to work.
I'm going to realise that a page is it's not going to happen.
The telegraphic and everything, it's just god awful nonsense, obviously. But that sort of percolated for another 10 years before I finally had a proper go at it. But that was the point. I can pinpoint it to that moment of when I went, actually, I wonder if I could ever do anything like that, because I would love to write something like with that power. And The Big Nowhere is just my favourite of his books. It's a bit of the unloved one, really, of his big sort of LA quartet, because you've got the first one is Black Dahlia, which obviously everyone knows because of the famous story, and then there was the film. And then obviously LA Confidential was the third one, which everyone knows, fantastic movie. This one comes in between, but for my money, it's the best. It's where he pretty much sets his template for what he then does in LA Confidential, and then his later American Tabloid, where he's got his three protagonists and they're all kind of crisscrossing and sort of working with each other and against each other. And for my money, he does it best here. And again, a bit like Cathi was saying, again, it is about a serial killer, but it's not really about it in the way that Hannibal Lecter is. It's really about the detectives and their lives, and just the sheer hell that they put themselves through, and the limits they're wishing to push themselves to, physically and morally, in order to kind of get to the bottom of this. And it's also got my absolute favorite last sort of paragraph in all of literature, actually, to be honest. I can pretty much recite it. I think it's just perfectly perfectly worded.
I guess, Cathi, there's an element of you being a fan of James Ellroy's work.
Yeah, I think he's a genius. I think he changed the game for everybody, because the thing he says that is so brilliant is, my book show the private nightmare of public policy.
Yeah.
And it's about how the biggest villains aren't those people scrabbling around at the bottom. They're the people at the top who are putting these policies in place. They're, the villains are there. And, he changes it. He writes about the secret histories of those times. And, the stories all interconnect, and they're all based on real things, and they're all based on much bigger crimes, perpetrated by the people in charge of housing, by the people in charge of the police, by the people in charge of institutions. And they're just amazingly well told, the LA Quartet. I mean, that's why I said those two, Derek Raymond and James Ellroy, are the Beatles and Stones of crime fiction for me. And obviously Ellroy's the Beatles because he's constantly changing and reinventing and breaking new barriers, whereas Cookie's the Stones, he's just playing the blues better than anyone else.
Yeah.
But everybody should read the LA Quartet and the Factory novels.
Yeah.
If it was my crime fiction school.
That's another thing altogether into a crime school curriculum. We'll maybe do that another time.
When we do our Noir syllabus.
Yeah. This is A-level stuff, isn't it? We're getting advanced here. And of course, James Ellroy has a new novel coming out, I think, next month. So that's something to look forward to with trepidation, probably.
Yeah.
I like the sound of it. It was I hadn't seen about it until you mentioned it, actually, Nick, on email. So I do like the premise. I like the setting and the time. So
he's back to the late 40s, isn't he? Which kind of feels like his home turf, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, and it's based on Fred Otash, who is a real life private eye at the time, but I think was the inspiration for some of his more famous characters in the original quartet. So it'd be interesting to see what he does with him now that he's going to give him his own book.
Yeah. Excellent. Right. I think we're getting closer drawn to a close, aren't we, Nick?
We are, yeah. A couple of minutes away.
Yeah. So do you want to quickly explain what we're coming up next month, all being well?
Are we all confirmed?
We are.
Okay. So next month we're doing 3-Book Friday again, last Friday of the month, and we have Heather Martin, who's Lee Child's biographer, and the other writer is Nick.
We have Joe Thomas, author of the Sao Paulo Quartet, which is a brilliant dark noir kind of rendering of Brazil and South American culture. And the fourth book, Brazilian Psycho, is published mid-June. So yeah, it's going to be great to have Joe come along and talk about them books as well as the influences on his own life. Yeah, you've known it quite well, don't you, Cathi?
Yeah, we share an interest in Tanky Challoner.
Yeah, it's another big London night, I think, isn't it? You know, there's other kind of London writing going on there. So yeah, fantastic.
So we're back next month. So thanks everyone for watching. Thanks to Rod and to Cathi for joining us for 3 Book Friday. And as I said at the outset, you know, just subscribe and like the video and get in touch with us. Use the hashtag 3 Book Friday, Noir 3 Book Friday. And yeah, thank you very much. It's been great.
Thanks, Cathi. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks a lot for having us. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.